Is Sony giving up on woke games? That seems to be on the agenda as we hear from an interview from Sony president as he talks about the massive failure Sony has seen this past year for sticking to an agendized, politicized gaming format that has not served them well when it comes to their pocketbooks. Of course, what I'm talking about is Concord, one of the biggest failures in gaming history this past year and maybe 30 years. And when you look at the track record and the amount of money Sony put into this game, over $400 million in development costs, not including the purchase of the studio itself at $100 million. This game is a $500 million failure in their books just for a measly 686 players to actually play the game for 2 weeks. And that is just a terrible result for this gigantic gaming company like Sony. And I think that's the situation that we're seeing here as the Sony president reflects on the massive failure of Concord and trying to understand what went wrong with the company. And he kind of suggests a few elements here that lean towards the westernized influence that had an impact on Sony's decision to push this game. And he puts it out specifically that Sony Japan is kind of a siloed agency where they focus on the games within their culture and they extend that offer to other studios to do things outside of their culture. And I think he reflects back on that with some regret, thinking that they should have applied some of their own cultural values and understanding of gaming to some of these studios that are outside of their country. And I think that's the situation we're seeing here with the COO and CFO Hiroki Totoki as he talks about the failure that Sony has been having these past few years in comparison to their massive successes. And when he talks about successes, he's talking about Helldivers. Helldivers 2 was one of the biggest games of the year. Yes, it had a decline with some controversies when it referred to the PSN network sign up that was forced upon the game players, and of course a bunch of bugs and unneeded updates to the gameplay status. But with fixing all that, it's still a game that is powering on strong with over 100,000 people playing daily. So that is a successful live service game, and Sony's looking back at Helldivers 2, all the corrections they made to get to this point, and they're saying that is the type of game that we want, and how we develop that game is doing it with a different culture. We saw with Helldivers 2, it stood away from all the politicizing that was enamored with some of the products like Concord that stuck their claim in their overall progressive attitude, their addition of gender pronouns, their look at LGBTQ fat acceptance, BLM activism, and the over-agendizing that made the design models of this game horrendously bad. And I think that's the situation we're seeing now with Sony president thinking about the successes they've had in the gaming industry, and they look back what actually carried Sony to a profitable quarter or year was not a Concord like game, was not like any of the other games they've been funding that have this attitude of political progressive activism at their core. These games usually are massive failures, and when they look back at their successes, all they see are games like Black Myth Wukong that ignored all those political activist messaging, where they just focused on the culture where they were from and produced games that gamers actually wanted to play with characters that were interesting and enjoyable. And I think that's the thing that they're getting with a lot of the Asian games that they're developing, where they're looking at some of the Western developers and thinking, okay, you guys don't know how to develop video games anymore, and we clearly have to guide you now because the games that you're producing are making us massive losses. And I think that's what the Sony president is saying right now, where they gave a free reign to these studios to do what they want because they thought they understood the culture they were producing the game for. But that was the opposite thing that they did see. They didn't know the culture they were producing for a lot of the times, and now Japan is recognizing they have to have an understanding of American culture better and what the fans actually want, and not just leave it to westernized game developers that have their own politicized perspective on what gamers should actually like. And you see the opposite with the Asian games that are produced, like from Korea, Stellar Blade, which was a massive success for the new developer Shift Up that just came onto the scene, became $1 billion company easily. And I think that's the situation we saw with Black Myth Wukong, a small developer in China that spent $50 million, and now it's $1 billion company that made over $1 billion in a month. This is what we're seeing from developers that know the culture and audience that they're working with. And it seems like Japan is understanding that fact. Even with themselves, their own games from a studio that they're shutting down made more money than the Concord game that they spent $400 million on. Of course, I'm talking about Astrobot, a game that they didn't really focus on that much, but is now a mascot for Sony now. And I think that's a situation they're seeing right now, where people that are focused on making good games, that are not focused on politics, are the main course for a profitable company. I think Sony has an understanding of that to some extent, with the Sony president coming out and saying, okay, these foreign developers, they may not know what they're doing. They're kind of out of their minds. It seems like that might be the case, and they have to have some sort of oversight. Of course, Sony is ensconced in ESG, DEI policies that we've seen all throughout the gaming industry for the past 10 years. But this is a time where a lot of companies can pivot now. We see this happening across the world and country, where gaming companies are pivoting away from these ESG policies, these pronoun warrior type of games that are destroying their entire companies and developers in their wake. And I think that's a situation that is slowly churning right now, as the cultural and social changes in society are reflecting back on a massive repudiation of this political activist messaging in any content now. And this is the ultimate consequence of actively seeing so much of this content for the past years, and the player base saying, we don't want this anymore, we just want a fun game. And I think that is what's playing out nowadays. That's why the Black Myth Wukongs can just outstrip any Western game in an instant, while developers in the West are saying it's just a bad economy. Well, it's not a bad economy if you make a good game, and that's just shoving it in the face of developers and console makers like Sony, like Xbox, to realize there are good games that will make you billions of dollars still if you actually make them. And I think that's the situation we're seeing slowly change in Sony, where Sony is thinking about this. Like, we can't trust some of these foreign developers, and the ones that we do trust have to be like Helldivers 2, where they're passionate about the content that they're making, and they're making content from a non-politicized standpoint, where they're making something purely for fun. You can have the funny politics therein afterwards, but it has to be made a fun game first. And I think that's what Helldivers 2. People may say it's a political statement, but it's just a riff off Starship Troopers, which was supposed to be a political statement. But regardless of the situation, it was just a fun movie to watch, and they made a fun game to play. And that is the essential thing to making something that is profitable. Make a fun game. And I think that's a lost art nowadays. Games like Concord, the game is not fun. It's not made with the care of a person that actually wants to make a fun game. It's made in the care of someone that actually wants to push out a message and agenda to the audience. And the audience can sniff this out in an instant, and that's why games like Concord, Dustborn, Kill the Justice League, any other game like Flintlock are failures now within the gaming industry. And I think Sony president is slowly understanding this. At least that's my interpretation of what he comments here in this interview. It seems like he's seeing that we're going in the wrong direction, especially with a smack in the face like Concord. Losing $500 million in total is just outrageous for a company like Sony, and there has to be a discussion. And of course, you can't skirt around the politicization of the game, because Sony has to look at it in an internal way, and they can't listen to the Western factors that are going to say, oh no, it's just oversaturation in the market, when you see obviously clearly from the fan base, from the gaming audience, saying, we don't like this stuff, what you're doing with the game. We don't want to hear pronouns. We don't want to hear any of your politicization. Your designs are ugly on purpose, because that is just your political agenda to de-beautify gaming, because you think it's a misogynist thing. We don't care anymore. We're trying to play a game that we like to look at, and that is actually fun to play. And I think that is a key thing that Sony has to take away from this. But who knows, maybe they'll take the wrong message, and maybe they'll double down, like we see people after they see the changing in the political landscape. But rather than learn a lesson, they may just double down and make something absolutely worse. But my comment is, I think they'll change for the better. Sony is mostly a money-based company, so I don't think they'll go the way Microsoft is going, which is down to the abyss of a woke nightmare that is probably going to lose thousands of jobs at Microsoft, Xbox, and I don't think there's any churning back for them. But Sony has a chance to churn back, and they have the culture to actually do it. So I'm optimistic with Sony. But those are my thoughts on the situation. I'd like to hear your thoughts. What do you think Sony's going to do? You think they're going to change or stay the same? You leave your thoughts, like, comment, share, subscribe. This is Wagner Knows Why. Catch you next time.